Antisemitism is often the canary in the coal mine to destroying democracy.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
We see that in places like Hungary, where autocratic leaders can use anti-Semitism as a way of then slowly attacking democracy. And so sometimes I think people think, oh, anti-Semitism, that's a Jewish issue. I'm not Jewish, or I am Jewish, but I can take care of myself. It's not a big deal, or other people have worse oppressions. But actually, anti-Semitism, it would be enough to fight anti-Semitism to protect Jews, but it's also about protecting democracy, because we often see that anti-Semitism is the first step toward the much broader deterioration of democracy.
Rabbi Jill Jacobs is CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. I sat down to talk with Rabbi Jill Jacobs in early October before the election, right as the Jewish high holidays were upon us. The empathy, wisdom, and inspiration that Rabbi Jill brings to the interview makes it timeless, and I'm grateful to be able to share it with you today. I want to make sure you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can also visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. That way, you'll never miss an episode and you'll have access to over 100 past interviews with guests like Dr. Anthea Butler, Jeff Charlotte, Bishop William Barber, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Dr. Jamar Tisby, Rob Reiner, and many, many others, and help spread the word about the State of Belief. Tell people in your networks about what you're hearing and subscribe today. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join in at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get started, there's something I wanted to get on your radar. I had the chance to have lunch with Catherine Stewart in New York, and it was so good to kind of meet the person behind the scholarship. She has a new book coming out in January, so it's something to look forward to. Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. And it's just a really important book. Plus, it's just so good to remember that we are all like human. And, Catherine has an amazing life, and I just admired her even more, getting to know her more. And it gives me courage in this moment to think about the amazing people who are coming together and showing up and speaking out. It's really important that we do. I'm very distressed by the news out of Texas, where they are imposing Bible stories on the curriculum for K through 5. And it seems benign. It's not benign. Like, if you see what's going on, this is a very particular Christian viewpoint that is trying to be imposed into the curriculum of public schools where everyone's coming together. Different kinds of families go to these public schools, and the legislator mandated the Bible onto the American people in a very particular way. It's terrible. It's terrible for American democracy, but it's also terrible for religion. Public schools are not Sunday schools, and it denigrates the religious formation when we kind of generically put it into public schools and pretend like we're not doing something that has a purpose that is deeply rooted in a kind of narrow evangelical right-wing propaganda effort. And so that's what this is. And it's one of several things that's going on with the prayer mandated in a particular way in Oklahoma schools. You can't make this stuff up. The Trump Bible is apparently the best Bible to buy 50,000 copies of, which will benefit Donald Trump's pocketbook. Again, I'm a Baptist minister. I believe in my faith. I believe how important it is, but I also see how it's just being used and how people are trying to impose it and how bad it is ultimately for my faith and also for American democracy. It's just like religious coercion is what is being put forward here. It's something that we need to be heads up about. It's only going to get worse, and it's going to require all of us speaking out and letting our voices be heard about how we want everyone to be able to thrive in public schools and public spaces. And just remembering that prayer is allowed in school already. Individuals can pray, even, groups can pray. we just don't want the government to mandate how we pray, how we are religious. So it's on my mind right now. I want you to know that Interfaith Alliance is speaking out about it and really getting activated on it, continuing to be activated about it. Find out more on interfaithalliance.org and join us. And now to my guest. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, mobilizing Jewish communities to advance human rights globally. She is a leading voice in the Jewish social justice movement and has written extensively on the intersection of Judaism, labor rights, and human dignity. Her books include Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community. With the world in turmoil and many people feeling pressure to take sides, it is particularly important to raise up the work of Rabbi Jill Jacobs and the organization she leads, and I am so happy to welcome her back to the State of Belief. Rabbi Jill, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So why don't you introduce us first to the organization, TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. It's an organization I have known, admired, supported, and I just want all of our listeners to really understand what this organization is and the wonderful person who's leading it. So can you introduce us to the kind of the history, the genesis perhaps of the organization, and what are your priorities in this critical moment?
Thank you so much. TRUA is an organization that organizes a membership of more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors across the United States and Canada. We have members, rabbi cantor members in 47 states and 6 provinces who are committed to human rights. Our work is about half our work is focused on where we live, the US and Canada, and half our work is focused on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And we're committed to fighting for the dignity of all people who are living in those places. So in the United States, our work focuses on democracy, which is really crucial right now, on worker justice, on immigration, and on incarceration. And in Israel and the occupied territories, we're focused on a just solution for both Jews and Palestinians, building toward 2 states so that both people can realize their national aspirations and can achieve dignity and human rights that everybody is due. So that's the word of the organization. But we're really proud that we can be here and bringing a rabbinic moral voice to that fight, both in the US and Canada and also in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. The organization was founded in 2002 by a group of rabbis who got together and said, we want a way to lift up rabbinic voices. And we've been going for now 22 years. And I don't know that the original founders could have predicted how badly we'd need this organization over the past many years, including in the Trump administration, including in the time of the early pandemic, and of course now in this past horrific year since October 7th.
Well, it's one of those organizations that it really feels like it's always been there. The need is so great. And I think it's so important that you're really leaning into what it means to recognize that leadership, especially religious leadership, especially on progressive issues, needs to have a voice, that we can't assume that people understand what the religious point of view is on issues like worker justice or incarceration or immigration. And what you're doing, it seems, is stepping into that and saying, actually, it's really important that Jewish leadership, rabbis, cantors, speak into this very clearly so that no one else, we have a lot of Christians who want to talk about how they own religion in America. It's just so important that Jewish religious leaders speak up, speak out, show up with these communities that really need a moral voice to frame the issue that they're facing.
Yeah, I think it's really important that progressive religious leaders, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, everybody, really speaks up and says that religion belongs to all of us and nobody gets to define what religious practice or religious belief or religious participation in the political sphere means. Unfortunately, in America, many of us have ceded the space of religion and politics to a certain far right element that for whom religion and politics is only about banning abortion or banning LGBTQ rights or trans rights or otherwise interfering with people's bodily autonomy and personal liberty. And of course, when you look at our religious traditions, they actually generally say not a whole lot about those particular issues. And they have a lot to say about how we're supposed to build a society together. So I think about, I mean, I have some of my books behind me, but there's a whole section of Jewish law. Jewish law is traditionally divided into kind of four categories or sections. And one of those has to do with civil law, which covers everything from to how landlords and tenants are supposed to relate to each other and how workers and their employers are supposed to relate to each other. There's Jewish laws that govern how much of your money you're supposed to give away in tzedakah and gifts to the poor and what counts as gifts to the poor, and lots of laws about how you're supposed to create the infrastructure for a community. So just basic laws about how people are supposed to live together.
When sometimes you're reading the Bible and like Amos, Isaiah, any of, but not just the prophets, others, and they'll be saying stuff about like workers' rights or the poor and stuff. And you're like, woo, if you took this out of context, there would be someone saying, why are you quoting like Marx at me? Or like, why,
Yeah.
it's that
sure.
radical. It's very clear that there is a moral way to live with one another. And I think it's so important that we lift up those aspects, because sometimes you'd think the Bible is just like 99% about abortion and then a few other things about how you're supposed to eat right. And instead, it's like has so much about the poor, so much about the incarcerated, so much about the immigrant welcoming the stranger. And I have to say, like, maybe it's just me, but like seeing, a rabbi has a certain stature for me, someone who's like really gone through rabbinic training like yourself. I'm like, oh, okay, they're coming serious now. Like they're going to be able to lay down some truths. So I think it's just great that Trua is doing this.
Thank you. And by the way, of course, there's only one verse that gets mistranslated actually to mean pretty much the opposite of what it actually means in the Hebrew, that gets used by some parts of the mostly far Christian right, but not only to outlaw abortion. And so the Bible absolutely does not, at least the Jewish Bible does not outlaw abortion at all. In fact, there's always a priority on the life of the parent, of the life of the mother, the parent, and not on the fetus. And that is consistent throughout Jewish law. And so to hear some people in the Christian right speak, you would think that the Bible is basically like verse after verse banning abortion. And it's
Yeah.
actually not there. You have to badly mistranslate a verse to get to a ban on abortion.
Yeah. And also, like, this is where it's so interesting when, we cry out religious freedom, but whose religion, whose freedom? When we talk about issues around abortion or LGBTQ rights or, other rights of people, race and other things, people are very quick to say, well, my religion says, but they ignore, Jewish law on these same issues. And also, this is a point of privilege, but like I've been doing research about my grandmother, who was the daughter of Louis Brandeis, and all of the women around her, many of whom were Jewish, who were just radical women working for labor rights in the late 19th, early 20th century, like going into factories saying you can't do this now. Whether or not they were like explicitly talking about their Jewish heritage, but if you look at like Lillian Wald and Nathan Maude and my great aunts, Pauline and Josephine Goldmark, they were all just so righteous and in the best way about you can't treat people like this. And I just think it's important that we carry these histories on with us and recognize, how important this has been to American society as a whole, but the contribution of the wider Jewish community, which was, a small percentage, but really making an impact on moving us forward as far as, how we treat one another, especially moving into the New Deal in really important ways.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a long history of Jewish women and men, but organizing labor unions, as you said, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and the garment workers
Right.
strike, right? There's a lot of history there. And I think even though those women weren't necessarily sitting and reading Jewish legal works. I think that it had seeped very deep in that this
Mm,
was something that you fight for.
right. We're in a moment where the latest FBI statistics on crime were very interesting. Crime of every kind was falling except for hate crimes. Hate crimes were the only kind of crime that have a special category that were rising. We also know that hate crimes are notoriously underreported. But even with that, hate crimes were reported as rising. And of course, anti-Semitism is one of the main foci of the areas of hate crimes, including anti-Muslim Arab hate, anti-Sikh hate. But I am curious how you understand this moment of anti-Semitism. I do want to say to our listeners, Rabbi Jill Jacobs has written the most important work on anti-Semitism. I really look to it towards helping me understand what anti-Semitism is in this moment, also what it isn't. And so I just want to, first of all, say thank you for that work,
Thank
which is, I bet you rarely get thanks for speaking out about anti-Semitism because everybody's so invested. It's
you.
very laden. But I want to say thank you for being, I would say, righteous and brave and clear about how to define anti-Semitism in this moment. And so if we can start by you just saying how people can find your work on anti-Semitism and then just maybe unpack a little bit of it for our listeners.
Thank you. Well, Tra actually just republished a very popular booklet on anti-Semitism. We published this booklet originally in 2022, but we realized it needed to be updated this year. So you can find it if you go to truah.org/anti-Semitism, all one word. So TRUAH/anti-Semitism, all one word, no hyphen. Then you can either download or you can order copies of a just really pocket-sized booklet we have that goes through some of the basic history of anti-Semitism, some of its manifestations, some stereotypes, and also, I think crucially for this moment, how to know when it's criticism of Israel and when it's anti-Semitism. Because of course, Israel is a country that can be criticized like any other country on its human rights or other record. And sometimes criticism of Israel does cross the line into anti-Semitism, which we've seen absolutely this year, including with justifications of violence against Jews, with attempts to ban Jews who don't disavow Israel from certain spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to say about anti-Semitism in general, anti-Semitism is a very persistent hatred. It goes back more than 2,000 years, but uh, really came into its power with in the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire had converted to Christianity. Then anti-Semitism also acquired state power and has come up in different times in different places, often drawing on the same group of tropes or ideas: Jews as greedy, Jews as all powerful, Jews as trying to do horrible things to Christians, Jews as kind of a nefarious force inside of society. So these come up in different ways from across the political spectrum. So very famously, Jews get blamed both for being Bolsheviks and for being capitalists, right? It's a very convenient kind of hatred. And something else that we know about anti-Semitism is that it tends to rise in times of social, political, economic upheaval. So when times are shaky, it's very easy to look around and say, well, who do I blame for my economic woes or for the instability of politics? Oh, here's a convenient scapegoat. And it also means that anti-Semitism is often the canary in the coal mine to destroying democracy. I mean, we see that in places like Hungary, where autocratic leaders can use anti-Semitism as a way of then um, slowly attacking democracy. And so sometimes I think people think, oh, anti-Semitism, that's a Jewish issue. I'm not Jewish, or I am Jewish, but I can take care of myself. It's not a big deal, or other people have worse oppressions. But actually, anti-Semitism, it would be enough to fight anti-Semitism to protect Jews, but it's also about protecting democracy because we often see that anti-Semitism is the first step toward much broader the much broader deterioration of
Right.
democracy.
I think like connecting this moment actually with 100 years ago with immigration, with imminent collapse after World War I, the 1920s, there was like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and that was anti-Black hatred, of course, but also anti-Jewish hatred, and a real sense of like they're coming from the outside, they're changing our history, they're changing our the nature of our country. And if we look at today with this great replacement theory, which is an anti-Semitic idea that somehow Jews are behind all of the immigration that is happening. And we see this popping up in a lot of the mass shootings that are happening. And it's just a very dangerous ideas that unfortunately gain a kind of mainstream dog whistle when you say something like Soros is trying to bring in all the, and people who are listening for it know exactly what that means is like, Soros is Jewish, Soros is controlling things. It's really like there's a very dangerous system out there that really has to be a bright light has to be shined on it. And we have to be very, very clear about what's happening, why they're saying it, and ultimately who they're trying to benefit. And it's just a very dangerous, and lives are at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen this, as you mentioned, in a number of horrific shootings that were also hate crimes. So, of course, the man who opened fire and killed 11 Jews in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the person who killed one Jewish worshiper in a synagogue in Poway, California, they really clearly put out manifestos or social media posts that referenced the Great Replacement theory and that were clearly anti-Semitic. But so did the people who carried out a horrific mass shooting in a grocery store in Buffalo that was aimed at killing Black people who are shopping there, or aimed at killing immigrants in El Paso at a Walmart. Right? Those were, even the victims of the shootings weren't Jewish, but a lot of the ideology behind that shooting was.
Up next, lots more with Rabbi Jill Jacobs. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
This week on Complexified, evangelical bros go from the pews to the polls in record numbers.
I don't fault churches for saying, yeah, we don't want to be a place that quote unquote bashes men. But I think there's a real fine line here between encouraging men without denigrating women.
That's author, editor, and host of Saved by the City podcast, Caitlin Beatty, on this week's Complexified from RNS Audio. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Rabbi Jill Jacobs, CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. This conversation was recorded just as the high holidays were upon us and before the election of 2024. So I do want to turn, to the reality of what's happening in Israel right now and the Middle East and the wider Middle East. And I know TRUA you've been on the ground over there since October 7th, well before October 7th, but on the ground. And I've really valued being on your mailing list and getting updates around, kind of what you've seen, what you've witnessed. And it just feels really important to have a voice that isn't filtered necessarily through, kind of, I'm not anti-media, but I'm just like, I think it's just helpful to hear your voice. And so this has been an incredibly difficult time for everyone over there, and especially those of us, and I include myself in this, who really have been imagining a future where Palestinians and Israelis can live together in peace. This has been just one of those, perhaps the most difficult time we've seen in our lifetime. And I'm just curious, like, one, how have you been able to move forward personally? Like, what spiritual tools you've been accessing for that, and then we can get to a little bit of what you've observed.
Yeah, those are big questions. I mean, the last year has been the hardest that I remember, from just that moment on October 7th, starting to see the atrocity that was happening. And it's been horrific on many levels. So first of all, just that day of more than 1,200 Israelis who were murdered by Hamas terrorists, and more than about 250 who were taken hostage, and so many others who were injured, and homes destroyed, and communities destroyed. And then, so that's one level. The level that I honestly wasn't expecting was some of the reaction of people on the far left. I'll say that when October 7th happened, it was a Jewish holiday here. It was a 2-day holiday. So it was the first day of a 2-day holiday here. And it meant that I was hearing news because people were coming into synagogue and sharing news, or just hearing it around the street, but I wasn't actually online, because I don't use electricity on those major holidays. And so I didn't see the reaction of some of the outside world until afterwards. And it was actually quite a shock to me to learn that there had been a march, a gathering in Times Square that was calling those Hamas terrorists who came in and murdered families, that they were calling them, saying that was a liberation force. And I've been, shocked throughout the year at people who are justifying violence against Jews and Israelis, including yesterday, as my friends and family were in their bomb shelters. I saw there were some people online talking about the Iranian resistance, and celebrating these bombs, when Hezbollah and Iran do not have anything to do with the legitimate Palestinian claims for an end to occupation and for a state of their own. Like Hezbollah and Iran do, they're not doing anything for Palestinians, but Hezbollah decided to enter this war anyway because it was an opportunity, and has been shooting rockets at Israel since October 8th. So it's been very, unfortunate, surprising to see people who generally fight for justice and human rights, and who one expects to be against violence, sometimes coming out in favor of violence when it's directed at Israeli Jews. And of course, then after October 7th, Israel's retaliation. I mean, Israel had a right to self-defense and a right to retaliate against Hamas, but the way that the war has proceeded, the way that Israel has carried out the war, has been horrific, and most likely has included war crimes. And we know, of course, that more than 40,000 Palestinians, including thousands of children, have been killed, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza is just really, really dire. And so we're trying as an organization to hold all of these things, which honestly shouldn't be hard, to say that the attack of October 7th was an atrocity, to say that Palestinians deserve to be safe, that this war needs to end. It needed to end months ago, so that the killing can stop, so that the hostages can come home, so that people in Gaza can hopefully rebuild their lives with a lot of international support. That we should avoid, that there should be an agreement that will avoid a much broader regional war, which will bring just untold disaster on civilians, both in Israel and in Lebanon and possibly Iran, depending on the scope of the war. So it shouldn't be hard to say all of those things, but unfortunately, a lot of the world has retreated into, has taken sides, right? We've become much more polarized, where people feel like if you want to be pro-Israel, you can't say a word about the 40,000 Palestinians who have been killed, and you can't say a word about the Lebanese civilians. And if you want to be pro-Palestine, you have to somehow justify October 7th, justify the attacks by Iran, justify the Hezbollah rockets, the year of Hezbollah rockets on Israel. And that's just not, it's not right. It's not moral. The moral position is to say that we need the war to end, and we need an agreement that will both bring back the hostages. There's another place where people think that if you're going to be pro-Palestine, you can't talk about the hostages. Just should not be true. That we need an agreement that's going to bring back the hostages, that's going to end the war, and hopefully avert a broader regional war that is already showing how disastrous it's going to continue to be.
Yeah, I just think it is amazingly hard to hold this space. And I'm grateful to you for holding it. It's a space that I'm trying to hold as well. And I honestly think ultimately we're representing the majority of the people with this, even though the majority of the people don't have a voice in this. But it's just so important. And one of the things that you were reporting from Israel, which I thought was so important for me to hear, was in this country, like the hostages, and people were putting up posters, and it was used in such a way that it became like a right-wing thing, and then to tear down the hostages thing became like a radical left-wing. It was just like it was a very straight, the use of this hostage thing in this country was one thing, but hostages meant something different in Israel. I mean, or not different. Maybe you can explain that to me, because that's, I think, something that's maybe lost in translation to many people in this country, like what hostages mean, what the hostages, unfortunately, many of whom have died now, but what they meant in this struggle.
This is absolutely a place where there is just a total breakdown in communication between the dialogue in Israel and the dialogue in the United States. So first of all, I want to say that taking civilians as hostages is a war crime, full stop. And of course, Hamas should have returned the hostages a long time ago. They're not going to. That is 100% a war crime, and they continue to commit war crimes every day that they hold on to them. And it became really clear very quickly in Israel that this government, which is the most extremist government that Israel has ever had, was not going to prioritize the hostages. And it became really clear almost immediately to the families and to others, to the kibbutzim that were attacked, from which many of the hostages were taken, that this government wouldn't prioritize them. And that's become just more and more clear, including that the prime minister has barely met with the families of the hostages. He's barely met with residents of the kibbutzim. It took months and months. And we know that in November, I was actually in Israel for this at the end of November, beginning of December, when we had the first ceasefire deal. And we had more than 100 hostages, including women and children, come home from that. And we also had a break in the fighting for as long as that ceasefire lasted. Unfortunately, Hamas then decided to break the ceasefire and return to fighting. But we saw that was what brought home the hostages, and also what brought temporary relief to people in Gaza was that ceasefire agreement. And since then, the Netanyahu government, also Hamas, but also the Netanyahu government, has just over and over torpedoed any ceasefire deal, adding new conditions and new regulations and tying the hands of the people who are sent to negotiate. And that is really clear to Israelis, which is why hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been out on the street behind the families of the hostages who have been leading. And I was in Israel, I guess this was in early May, and I was out at a protest that was blocking the Ayalon, which is a major highway in Tel Aviv. And on one of the cars that was stalled was Einav Zankauer, who's been one of the most prominent voices of the families of the hostages. Her son Matan is a hostage, and she is a former voter. She's a former Netanyahu voter, and she's been really clear. She
Mm.
voted for him. She's not going to do it again. She's been unbelievably brave, and I don't even know how she does it as a mom after a full year. And she said, I remember in that moment, it was the day before what became the invasion or the extension of the war into Rafah, the first invasion into Rafah. And she was standing there on top of a parked car saying, do not go into Rafah, end the war. She's saying this in Hebrew, obviously. And, like the most important thing is bringing my son and the other family members back. And that has been a constant, she's been a constant voice. The other family members have been a constant voice. They've gotten kicked out of Knesset for going in and yelling at cabinet members. And we saw the horrific, at the beginning of September when the bodies of 6 hostages were discovered in a tunnel. They had been apparently murdered, just shot when their captors heard soldiers overhead. The when that happened, I mean, that just sent shockwaves through Israel. And we had the Saturday night afterwards, there were an estimated 700,000 Israelis on the street demanding a ceasefire, an end to the war, bringing home the hostages. And just in context, we're talking about a country of less than 10 million people. So I think it works out to the equivalent of about 23 million Americans out on the street, which I don't think we've ever seen for any issue ever.
Right. I mean, it's that's the reason it's so helpful to have your voice and also your witness and persistence. And I want to lift up a name that of a woman who was killed in October 7th in the aftermath, with Vivian Silver. Did you know Vivian Silver?
I knew her only a little bit, but I knew her work really, really well.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's good to remember someone like that who had worked her whole life for peace between Palestinians and Israelis. And yeah, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about her work and what, what she stood for?
I mean, Vivian Silver was one of the founders of Women Wage Peace, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's Israeli women, which includes both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, who were working for peace and insisting that there's no military solution, there's only a political solution. And they had a partner called Women of the Sun, which is a Palestinian organization. So, as people might know, there's Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. About 20% of Israel's citizenship is Palestinian, and they are, 100% citizens of Israel. And then there's about 5 million Palestinians who don't have any citizenship education. That's what I mean. So Women Wage Peace works with a Palestinian group based in the territories, and they really have lifted up this idea that you need women at the table to make peace, and that women are, without being gender essentialist, that often women are able to push forward solutions that are going to keep their family safe, which generally military solutions don't do. We know there's an organization called, I think it's called the Institute for Inclusive Security, that has research that shows that when women are at the table in peace negotiations, they are, I believe, 35% more likely to succeed and to last for at least 15 years. So it's not just a nice idea, but it actually has a real impact on peace negotiations. And Vivian was until the end. I mean, as she was hiding in her safe room, she was on the phone at one point with a radio radio personality, an interviewer who had interviewed her, and saying again that she still believes in peace. And that's something that her sons have continued to fight for. Her sons had not been public personas before her death, but now they've been very, very public, saying that they want to continue that their mother's work, that they know that their mother would not have wanted there to be more death in her name. And also Maoz Yinon, whose both of his parents were murdered on their kibbutz on October 7th, has been a really important voice with Palestinian partners. And in my experience, our partners on the ground in Israel are human rights organizations, and to a person, every single person, including in some cases people who were trapped in their safe rooms for 7, 8, 11 hours, they will say, Hamas murdered my family, they murdered my friends, they murdered my neighbors, but they cannot change who I am. Like they cannot change my moral core. And that's been unbelievably powerful to hear over and over. I'll mention one more person, Avi Dabush, now Rabbi Avi Dabush, who is the head of Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel, which is a close partner of ours. And he lives in a kibbutz in the south that he was in his safe room with his family and could have easily been killed, and has gone on um, to just fight for the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, to call for an end to the war. And he's somebody who lost people who are very close to him in his community, and has turned around to say there's no military solution, that there has to be a diplomatic solution.
I remember seeing a really striking poll that came out after the war started, which was that they did a poll of Palestinians in Gaza, and something like 60 to 70% of them wanted peace with Israel. They wanted to move forward, to develop better relationships. And yet Hamas, maybe in part because of that, Hamas chose another way. And so, I just think what I really appreciate what you're lifting up these names is because it's important to recognize that this is a very low point, but it doesn't mean that it's an end point for the peace movement.
Yeah, I can say something about that research. I mean, that was done by Dr. Shikaki, who is just a veteran, like very respected Palestinian public polling expert, public opinion expert. And, the numbers go up and down depending on people's despair. So I think that, like you said, in the spring, there were some numbers that 62% of people in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, said that they favored a two-state solution. I think the last poll that was done in September, it went back down to the 30-something%. But it's still, of all the solutions that are presented, it's the one that people, even though it's a very small number, it still is a plurality. But also, ultimately, it's not about public polling. It's about actual leadership who are willing to take risks and to explain to their people, this is the solution we need to move forward. I think so much about the peace deal with Egypt, with Begin and Sadat, both of whom had very long, very bloody histories behind them, and were able in that moment to say the most important thing is for us to make peace. And these were not countries that loved each other. It's a cold peace, but it's a peace that's lasted more than 50 years and has been just unbelievably important and stabilizing for the region. And I don't even think we can estimate how many lives have been saved by that peace. And we need leaders like that. I mean, Sadat obviously in the end lost his life because of that. And I'm not saying that I don't want anybody else to lose their life to make peace, but we need people who are going to step up and be brave enough to say, this is the way to move forward.
Yeah, we just observed President Carter's 100th birthday, and I had a chance to talk to him about those negotiations at Camp David, and it was very tense, but everybody was very kind of, he said it was really important that everybody had their own room to pray and practice their, who they were in real time, but then also was able to come to some agreement. I'm so grateful for you and so appreciate you taking the time with us. And Rabbi Jill Jacobs, I'm going to end this interview by asking you the question that I ask everyone, which is maybe the most difficult in this moment, but what gives you hope?
What really gives me hope is the people who, even in the most difficult circumstances, are fighting for justice, or working to end to end the war, to bring about peace. So I mentioned the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are out on the street every Saturday night, sometimes even under threat of missile attack, to call for an end to the war. I think about the Palestinians who are saying that Palestinians who are standing up to Hamas, or Palestinians who are partnering with Israelis to work for peace. Just this morning, the morning before Rosh Hashanah starts, I got a voicemail overnight from a Palestinian partner just to wish me a happy new year and hoping for a year of peace, et cetera, et cetera. This is, somebody who lives under very difficult circumstances and has made it a priority to have Jewish and Israeli partners. And Palestinians who are pushing back, who are committed to nonviolence and nonviolent defense of their villages, sometimes when violent settlers are coming in and trying to and causing damage and carrying out attacks against villages, and Israeli activists who come to stand with those Palestinians. So just all of the people who have had such great loss in their lives and are not giving up and not walking away and not turning to violence, but instead are recommitting to partnership and to working for justice.
Rabbi Jill Jacobs is CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. Rabbi Jill, thank you so much for being with us today on The State of Belief.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.